Good morning. I hope that this day finds you well and experiencing the love of our Heavenly Father. Today I want to start our study off by turning to Psalm 99 verse 1. David, who was the king of Israel, writes these words: "The Lord reigns, let the nations tremble. He sits enthroned between the cherubim, let the earth shake." Here David is drawing our attention to certain things that we need to understand. David was a king. He ruled over his subjects being the Israelites. They had to do what he instructed them to do. But here David draws our attention to the fact that God is the King of Kings, and it says there that He reigns. Let the nations tremble. Why? Because He rules over nations. It says there that He sits enthroned between the cherubim. And we find this very interesting, that He has subjects who heed His instruction. And then it says further, let the earth shake. So we see quite clearly here that David wants us to understand that God has a throne and He rules from this throne. And we understand that God has a kingdom and the universe is His kingdom, and everything that is in it is subject to Him. I want to draw your attention back to Daniel. And in Daniel chapter 7, we see in verse 8 something that this little horn does. It says there, "The horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully." So I want you to see something here, that characteristics are given to this little horn of a person, a man, and that this man speaks boastfully. We're going to be looking at this a little bit more. But the question I want to ask you here, is it possible that you could be that man? I want you to think about it. Is your heart not your throne? Is it not where you rule from? Don't you tell people what to do around you that are subject to you from your throne? Do you perhaps have a kingdom? And is your kingdom subject to God's kingdom? I want you to notice that right here, just after we get this thought about the little horn having the mouth and the eyes of a man, that we find this strange diversion away from it, as if we also, like David, taken back to God's kingdom. And I want you to notice that it says in verse 9, "As I looked, thrones were set in place." Very interesting. We have other kingdoms set in place. "And the Ancient of Days took his seat." Wow. So we have the kingdoms of the world gathered in front of him, and the Ancient of Days takes his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were opened. Dear friends, here we are introduced to the fact that we are going to have to give an accountability to this Ancient of Days. Our thrones are going to be placed before him. Those that are subject to him, angels, thousands and millions of angels surround him. His glory is like a consuming presence. We see this. And then right after that, verse 11 says, again, all of a sudden, taken away from that position, we brought back to the little horn. And the little horn, he says, "I continue to watch, because the boastful words the horn was speaking." Who was he speaking these boastful words to? And what were these boastful words? Today I want you to see what we need to understand. Who was he addressing these boastful words to? Now in Isaiah chapter 14, verse 13 and 14, we are introduced to one of the cherubim. His name was Lucifer, morning star. He used to be a covering cherub, right in God's presence. But listen to the heart of this angelic being. one who was subject to God. Listen to what he says. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. Here we see that the objective of this little horn was, when we understand his heart, is that he wanted to ascend to heaven. He wanted to raise his throne above the stars of God. That means, again, he wanted to rule over God's subjects. It says further, I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly. Here we've just discussed the Mount of Assembly in Daniel. And the Mount of Assembly, as we've looked there, is all about who are seated before him. He wants to be the Ancient of Days. It says further, on the utmost heights of the sacred mountain. So we see here the sacred mountain, as we've already discovered, is God's kingdom. And he wants to rule not only this world, but God's kingdom. It says further, you said in your heart. Again, we come back to this whole understanding. You said in your heart, verse 14, I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Dear friends, when I read this, I became very concerned. Because is it possible that without us knowing that we could be the man of this little horn? Let me explain. In Matthew chapter 13, Jesus tells us a parable of the weeds and the tares. And you can read it from verse 24 right up until the end of verse 30. And then there's an explanation given in verse 36, which we're going to come to. But Jesus says these words, and he starts off in verse 24 by saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in the field. So here Jesus draws our attention to the kingdom of heaven. And we find that he sows good seed, and then all of a sudden we find there are weeds. But I don't want to go into that. Go and read that. In Matthew chapter 13, though, Jesus gives an explanation of what is going on. And he says there in verse 37, the one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. That's Jesus Christ. The field is the world. Listen to this, dear friend. The field is the world. That's where we are. And the good seed stand for the sons of the kingdom. That means it's those who have chosen to be subject to the Son of Man. Those who have chosen to be followers of Christ. Those who have chosen to be called Christians. It's interesting, it goes on further to say, the weeds are the son of the evil one. Here we understand all of a sudden that the devil, this morning star, has followers, people who also desire in their heart to raise their thrones above God's throne. It says there, and the enemy, verse 39, who sows them is the devil. And then the harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. Dear friends, we see so clearly here that there is this division, there is this following either of the God, who is the King of the universe, who was represented on earth by his Son, the Son of Man, and we can be his followers, or we can choose to say in our hearts, we will raise our kingdoms above God's kingdom. We will be like God. You know, dear friends, it's so interesting that when you look at Daniel chapter 7 verse 25, we're going to discover this tomorrow. But he speaks against God. And how does he do this? This we'll see tomorrow. But dear friends, you know, as I walk around, when I talk to people, they reject that God is the King of the universe. They reject his kingdom. They reject his existence. And yet we are clearly told that we will assemble before him and judgment will be set. Dear friends, what do you say about the I am? Who is he to you? Is your kingdom subject to his rule? Or have you raised your heart above the stars of God? Have you desired to sit enthroned on God's seat? I want you to understand, dear friends, that as we look at this little horn and his characteristics, that we need to look at our own little kingdoms And we need to ask ourselves this question: are we subjects of God, the King of the universe, the Ancient of Days? Are we His subjects? Have we said, Thy will be done in our life as you've desired it in heaven? Dear friends, are we subjects of God or not? I want you to think about this today as we look further at this little horn in future studies. May God bless you.